here's how this happened about a month ago. I think it was Chris or somebody sent out a note. It's like, hey, who can do the who can be the moderator of the October 24th one? And I said, I will if somebody picks the paper. And then Chris said, how about this? So that's where we landed on the lunar solar calendar stick, and by Alexander Marshak. And I don't know. I hope everybody read it. That would be the object, sort of coming here. And so tonight, what I really wanted to talk about, I mean, I made a whole bunch of notes myself, but it doesn't have to be all me, but sort of all this stuff is this is a big paper about a stick. And so I started asking myself, why is it like it's, I can't remember how many pages, it's 20 pages. It goes into a lot of detail in the carvings and markings and the way the stick is laid out and what it's about and what it serves and all that stuff. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff really interesting embedded in the paper, including sort of a bit about the history of archaeoastronomy, a little bit about cultures, a little bit about lunar calendars in general and intercalary. And it's really, really deep. There's a whole bunch of avenues that it explores, surrounding this, singular important artifact that is a solar calendar stick. And so I wanted to kind of let's talk sort of about the paper, sort of like dig into the thing itself and what we know about it, where it came from. But also I'd like to kind of go down some of these other avenues about the bigger importance of what we can find archaeologically, what we can't, so and I think Marshank his writing's a little dense for me. I'm not necessarily used to scholarly papers, but it's I think he sort of dives into a lot of things that are very important. And so does that sound good with everybody?
Sounds great.
So let me kind of just start. Of course, what this is, the object itself, is kind of, he points out, it's kind of singular in nature. This paper was written, by the way, in 1985, I guess, mid 80s. It looks like it kind of in the middle of his career. It was more known, I think, for a book, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, because you're into these authors and these writers far more than I, but he wrote a book, Roots of Civilization. And Marshank himself, I think the most focus of his career, of his archaeological career, is more Upper Paleolithic in Europe. And that's kind of, I think, where he cut his chops and where he did most of his work, especially in sort of maybe hunter-gatherer cultures in post-Ice Age, sort of 10,000 years ago. And that's kind
yes,
of...
if I could just interject. Probably one of the things that is most I would say popular within our field of archaeoastronomy is that he proposed a lunar calendar, the oldest lunar calendar, Paleolithic, that was inscribed on bones found in Europe.
And I forgot the name of that bone, but you're absolutely right. So there was it was like I think I saw, I mean, it has kind of like one of those famous names, like the Rosetta Stone. This is a something bone, and yeah, he was talking. He used he sort of analyzed it for the whole pattern, and derived a lunar calendar from that. So I thought you were gonna go grab the bone.
This book, right?
What's that?
Oh, sure, you have this book, right?
Oh,
Space Exploration in 100 Objects.
Oh yeah.
And I think the first one in here is, I only grabbed it because it is very apropos to what we're talking about. The Avery Blanchard bone. Wow.
Yeah, that's it. The Blanchard bone. That's the one I was just, yep.
But it's very similar to what we're...
A little bit ago, I thought, I just sort of thought I should get interested in a little bit more that what he had done. So I went back and did something of a Wikipedia search. I found some of these things as well. So anyway, I find the paper in itself and his writing about this particular thing, it looks extremely well researched. He goes into a tremendous amount of detail. But you can also tell the breadth of his experience across, I mean, he's bringing in sort of Siberian and East Asian work and European work and other cultures and other hunter-gatherer cultures all around the world. And kind of, one of his big things, I'll sort of cut to the end a little bit, is where he's trying to take this, is he believes that this stick represents a knowledge base that was probably more derived from Asia than it was from Mesoamerica. So the traditions are very wholly different. And these traditions of this particular Winnebago Indians and this particular stick and the culture that made this relate more to Asia than it does to South America and in its time frame. And so that's part of one of the cases he's making. Back to the stick. As he explains in his paper, to sort of like start with, there was an opportunity in the early 1800s, I think it was about 1830, 1825, 1830, where the United States was trying to set up treaties, meaningful treaties with many, many, many different Native American groups, especially throughout the Midwest and all of that stuff. And it became very popular to sort of be seen shaking hands and like, making peace with these, with Native American chiefs. And so it was a big sort of thing in Washington. And as Marshank points out, that is part of that, not just here, but in other things. It was very common to send a portrait artist out to sort of like, kind of capture the Native Americans and capture the chiefs and the leaders. And in this particular case is a portrait of a chief. I don't have his name right off the bat here, but included in that portrait was this calendar stick, this particular artifact, the one that he's talking about. And so the stick itself is about 113 centimeters long. So what's that going to be? About 48 to 52 inches would be my guess on that. It is square in nature, or it has 4 faceted sides. And then each side of the stick is inscribed with a series of tick marks and sort of like things, and then little notations, astronomical notations as it goes along. I'll get more into the detail of that as we go. So here we have this stick. It went back to this particular chief's family, and then eventually it was acquired by a private owner, and eventually the stick made its way into some sort of archival repository where it could be found and studied and all that. Marshank makes the point at the time in 1985 that that this was kind of singular. There aren't a lot of these, and or this one in particular is essentially more important than others just because of the detail and what it means and how close it was to the ethnography and all of these things. He does make a case, though, that there are other references to other cultures, including in the Southwest. I think Zuni was part of this thing, Acamel, Otham, Pima and Papago, as he called it back then. They had a tradition of sort of marking or sun watching or that kind of thing. But he really, as he dives into this particular paper, this particular stick is represented as kind of singular in nature and important because of its detail and the knowledge it imparts. So let me just take you there for a little bit. I think the most important pieces here that he's trying to make is that this is both a solar and lunar calendar, and so there's a way to do day counts. There's a way to sort of like mark out a year. This one is a little bit more refined than that because it essentially, the basis of it is a lunar calendar system. But then there are places and there's markings where he interprets them as sort of extra days or skipped days or intercalary days, as we do, so that this particular stick can not only sort of deal with the lunar calendar, but also adjust for and make the transition between lunar and solar. And he goes into quite a little bit of detail about little markings and points and things like that on the stick that give him that reference. I was kind of fascinated by that idea. He determined that, and I think this is really, really super important for the case, especially about the Asian context of this, is that the months are divided by 3 rather than a traditional sort of, as we understand it, a Western month divided by 7. And he goes into that a little bit, not very much, but a little bit, sort of just basically a working idea that months are phased in approximately 7-day phases, and that those 7 days became essentially a quarterly designation of dividing your given months. In his case, he points out that it seems to be real here that in this particular case, they divided the month into 3. And in particular, starting with a new moon and then 2 specific 10-day cycles, which never really vary, and then a 3rd cycle that does vary in time from some short days to some long days. Then he ends his month with the last crescent moon of before sunrise. So he captures crescent moon to crescent moon, and then notes that the sun disappears for 2 days, or 1 day, or 3 days, or sort of whatever. There's a period where you don't see the moon. He takes those out of his calendar. They're not part of that thing, and he designates that. And then he starts again, crescent moon to crescent moon, 10, 10, and then a number. And the numbers, as you sort of add them up, and he makes that case in the paper, is that it's sort of, it's 28 to 32 days. A lunar cycle is actually about 29 and a half days. And so this all tracks with what you would actually observe and how you would do it. I think he really emphasizes the idea that these are non-arithmetic. And I don't understand how he's using that terminology. Maybe, Chris or Greg, if you want to help, but he's very specific to say this isn't an arithmetical calculation of lunar cycles, but it's specific to be non-arithmetic and absolutely observational. So it's basically,
Yeah, I think I can offer
yeah,
insights.
so help me
more,
sort of why he's using that terminology and what's that.
More importantly, I think Timothy Palkatot can offer a little explanation.
Who's this again?
Timothy Palkatot's book on archaeology of the cosmos.
Oh, okay.
It's a fantastic book. I couldn't recommend it enough. It focuses more on Cahokia,
okay,
and that culture. But some of the points that he summarizes from Marshak and some other sources are that what the non-arithmetical talking point is really that it's an observational stick, right? It wasn't planned out ahead using math. It was literally sat there day by day making notches.
but then continues that way. So it's not a calculator by that standard, right? Then it's just really observation and then predictability of what you can observe.
Yes, and the point,
last observation.
yeah. Right? So what he says here on page 74 of this book, I think it's on page 74, is he talks about I think this is what I'm looking at. So besides transgenerational observation, calendar sticks and the skyline can facilitate accurate horizon viewing, which could facilitate accurate horizon viewing would be all that was necessary. So I think it was the fact that the calendar stick, when it was formed in conjunction with horizon viewing from a specific location and making the notches the half moon, the crescents.
Yeah.
Instead of saying predictively, this is when it's going to happen. It's like my impression is that it was a work in progress until it was finished, and then it could be reused again using the intercalation.
I think that's an accurate account of it, and that's the way I was reading it as well, Chris. I think that's exactly right, and that's where. But he made it's in his premise, and it's right throughout. He sort of this is a difference of these things. So aside from the try system of dividing months by 3, another thing here is that the calendar stick is in half years. And so essentially, you remember I said there's 4 sides. So there's an A, B, C, and a D. And each one is essentially 6 lunar months, and with some notations at the end that take you to the next side or whatever. I thought that's really interesting. And then at the very end of the paper, sort of cutting to that chase again, he says that we find this in Siberian and Asian and Eastern European cultures. And that's one of their things. They sort of measure things years in 6-month cycles as opposed to 12-month cycles. This does that. It also, he notes that it reads backwards, right? Backwards for us, right? But it basically reads right to left in the first series of 6 months, drops down to the next level, and then reads left to right in the next series. And then I sort of got lost in here, and I meant to go back and reread it, but in sides C and D, he's kind of making the argument that they change change that, and they can use the markings to actually mark 3-year cycles with the opportunity to add a month to correct the solar to lunar cycle, which is very similar to what happens in culture today, right? So we do 3 years of 12 lunations, and then we add a 13th to make everything line up again. And the Chinese calendar does that. The Jewish calendar does that. So that's kind of how that works. But anyway, so this idea of 6-month cycles, starting and stopping at new moons, and then the 3 parts to a month. That's I think kind of unique to this, and that sort of is the dominant, kind of premise of this particular stick and how it was used and why it was. So there's, I think, an important thing here, and I kind of caught it as I was rereading this afternoon. Let me see if I can find the page for that. I wanted to kind of just sort of, so he states very emphatically, kind of towards the end of the thing. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, so I guess what I'd like to do is kind of take this into a couple of different things. First of all, the knowledge that we're talking about here, the use of the moon as your principal calendar, the knowledge it takes to turn that into sequences that can be ritualized and then also annualized on a practical solar calendar, which is the one that drives your seasons, all that stuff. He makes the case that this is really not something that can be archaeologically found. And so the importance of a stick like this is that particular system of understanding your world, understanding nature. I know this is getting a little bit into the depths here, is actually not something that renders itself archaeologically. And so I think that is also an important part of the paper in general, is like, we are always asking ourselves, what can you derive from an artifact? What can't you? How far you can go in using a single calendar stick to basically understanding the ritual cycles and the culture and the cultural values of a particular place. And then opposite of that, how can you find those values and the nature of their understanding of astronomical thought in the architectural record? And so there's a really sort of, I think he plays that very well, and sort of comes in the back third of the paper when he's kind of just talking about I'm sort of losing my thought here, but essentially what we can derive. He also points out that in the beginnings of archaeoastronomy, astronomers essentially bring the specific calculation of astronomical phenomenon to the table, right? And what he's arguing here is that this is not that. And so that this is actually specifically sort of an observational way of kind of keeping track of the lunar cycles for whatever reason they wanted to do that. And so anyway, I thought that was kind of a fascinating part of this. And then he kind of just sort of also points out that a stick like this also introduces a whole bunch of these issues amongst the people that study archaeology, people that study culture, people that do that kind of thing, because it's specific in nature and limited in what we can derive from it. And so I thought that was kind of an important part of the paper. Also, I wanted to point out something that just drives me crazy, but I'm going to stop for a second and let everybody sort of catch up with comment or whatever. So you've all read the paper. I'm just kind of spewing out what I think are the important parts and sort of how Marcia can say this. But does anybody have something they want to share?
I was going to add that this is an instrument. Basically, this is what they've created is a scientific, to me, a culturally derived scientific instrument for observing astronomy. And while it was based on observation, especially correlated with the horizon, and I find it interesting to think about the idea that, what other, we talk about, can it be archaeologically derived? What other artifacts out there that have markings on them that we don't understand what they are? There could be lots of different things.
Yeah.
That might be related to calendrics. The other thing that I do know is, and this relates to our Fuchs archive project, that there was a letter Fuchs wrote to an engineer about the kind of instruments or kind of architectural construction instruments that the ancestral pueblos had, for Mesoamerican. And Fuchs wrote back that, they had plumb bobs and things like that they found. But that he had also observed at his time in Hopi an instrument used for measuring the amplitude of the sun on the horizon.
Amplitude. That's an interesting term.
So this is something that actually kept track of how far the sun was going up and down the horizon. This is one of the reasons I'd like to get into his notebooks. Ray Williamson mentioned that other people have written about this particular object Fuchs was talking about, but I haven't been able to find any references to it yet. But I would imagine that he wrote it down and possibly even drew it in his notebooks.
It'd be great to see.
Yeah, I think they're out there. We just have to begin to learn how to recognize them. And that's where our, working with Native Americans and indigenous peoples can help us understand items that we don't.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, Rick, on this stick, did he also mention in this paper that some of the day notches had little dot markers above them, right? That would represent of sacred days or ceremonial days?
Yeah. So yes, he sort of he lays it out very logically, right? So basically, you have day markers and tick marks. You have the specific starting and stopping points of the months, and
with the crescent
in the center of with the crescents, and in the center of this thing, there's something that represents a full moon. So you have essentially that cycle during your given months. But then he also goes into there's some markings he's finding and he's interpreting in a couple of different ways. First of all, he's interpreting them to be sort of added like ad hoc or during. So it's in the practice of creating the stick, like a different device at a different time was used to make these other little markings. And in some cases, Marchand interprets them as perhaps a ritual happening, something that has to happen at that particular time because it's in their ritual sequence, or some other things like relationships to equinox or solstices along the way of the lunar calendar. And so I don't know. He doesn't go into enough detail for me to just wholeheartedly accept, yep, that's exactly what those are. He's making the suggestion that the extra marks, the little dots, the little things that appear along the calendar are probably added and mark some sort of significant event, either something observed like a conjunction or something like that, or a specific day for a ritual. So yeah, so that's one of his things.
I would agree with him, because I would think that would probably be the whole reason for the calendar stick.
Yeah.
Not just for watching the moon for its own sake, for its own value, but how it relates back to their cultural significance of their ceremonial days.
I think that is correct. I think that's correct. So who's sharing? Is this John? Are you sharing this?
Yeah. I throw this up here just to jump in a little bit. This is a petroglyph series out in Surprise Tank, there by Barstow, California. And what's very interesting about it, you'll notice the 3 concentric circles at the bottom. The top figure, I believe, is the moon. Looks like a letter D.
Oh, I see.
A symbol for the moon. And the 3 central glyphs, one looks like a plant, but it's actually a hand. There's a horizontal line below it, just above those 3 concentric circles, and an image for the sun a rectangle divided in half to the right. Those three, I believe, go together. And if my theory is correct, which there's other supporting information nearby, this is the D for the moon, the plant with the line under it, and the sun together are Chinese words. Ancient Chinese from about 500 BC. You can tell by the style of the writing. And I believe this is the period of the moon is 3 10-day weeks, the concentric circles.
Yeah, okay.
I throw that out there just because it's been verified by people who know the ancient Chinese that, yeah, those are the right symbols, especially the 3 in the middle, which means period. The plant coming from the ground with the sun, those 3 symbols together, they have to be together like that. In ancient Chinese means time period. So what this appears to be is that somebody who knew that carved it in the basalt out there in Surprise Tank near Barstow, that the period of the moon is 3 10-day weeks.
It's
Now
interesting.
that might tie into the Asian theory about some of the origin of the stick you're talking about. Because again, in ancient Chinese, it reads a beginning right to left. Not this glyph, but
Right, yeah.
Chinese in general, as on the stick you were saying. So seems somehow there's information being shared trans-Pacific long ago dealing with cylindrical items.
Yeah, yeah, and that's exactly sort of where Marshank is going. I mean, that's one of his major defining sort of conclusions of the paper is he feels that the influence of Asian and sort of the Chinese culture is what's driving their understanding of the lunar systems and the 3 week. That kind of stuff.
And if you put that in context with the recent discoveries, such as at Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, where they've got 16,000-year-old Japanese points, the 22,000-year-old footprints they've now got down at White Sands. It appears that throughout history, maybe just sporadically, but more periodically, there was trans-Pacific exchange of intellectual content.
Would be. Well, there also, it occurred to me when I was reading this, and I guess I didn't make the notes, so I wasn't going to bring it up, but there's also known to be waves of Asian migrations to the U.S. So it wasn't like it just, I mean, we're sort of we're taught
Right.
Ice Age, Bering freezes, land bridge, they come over and then they're here. But actually, it probably happened dozens and dozens of times over centuries. And so there's this constant waves.
They've moved away from the land bridge. In fact, they've proven that it could not have supported life at that time. And then you've got, for instance, there at White Sands, the 22,000-year-old footprints. Well, that's right in the middle of the glacier maximum. You're not walking over then. And they've moved more. Even the Field Museum here in Chicago has gone to it, a sea route. They came over with their kayaks every now and then. Maybe a storm blew them over. Maybe they came over on purpose. But periodically, there were these migrations.
They're hunting for sea otters.
Well, I'd rather take a boat than walk across the ice.
From some petroglyphs I saw in Maui about a year and a half ago, I have a pretty good idea that maybe some of the Polynesians didn't stop at Hawaii. There's a lot of very similar motifs in the Southwest.
In fact, in this paper, he also mentions research he did in the Nicobar Islands, if I remember that correct. Those are South Pacific, and yeah, sort of same kind of thing. So the same sort of basis of describing lunar months and describing them in 3 parts instead of 4 is also all that is part of that same thing.
Which
Hey,
Michael Zelick
go ahead. Yeah.
set forth. He noted that early on, that similarity. So yeah, with what you're mentioning about the South Pacific, that goes right back to the Kon-Tiki.
Right.
Absolutely. Let me change gears a little quick because something in papers always drives me crazy. But the so what you're seeing here is essentially in the stick. This is line B, and this is what he was talking about. So basically, this is the end of one cycle over. Can you see my arrow?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is the end of one cycle, and this would be a new moon. That would, I mean, not a new moon, an old moon. It would be the crescent moon associated with just before a new moon. So the last time you can see the moon in the morning, and then the other one on this side is the first time you see the moon in the evening, right? And so you're looking essentially, as he's describing it, this sort of means that you're sort of associating in 2 different directions. This is an Eastern phenomenon. This is a Western phenomenon. And then just the nature of the moon and how it operates, of course, this circle or this arc right here would point to the sun. So the sun is down here. That is not viewable in this particular configuration, right? So if it's a new moon, it's harder to see anyway. If the sun is somewhat just above it, then it's not a moon that you would actually sort of see. So this also sort of, almost has to be inferred, or it's not as obvious to me what we might be looking for in a crescent moon that is just before a new moon. Famously, religions all over the world have sort of associated this particular first crescent with essentially the start of a religious cycle or religious calendar and all that stuff. This doesn't come into play that often. And so, I'm not saying that's not it. It's not representative, but I'm having a little tough time understanding what is observable, what is viewable, and how do they see it, or is it somehow inferred? And then if that's the case, how do they make these calculations? I guess that's really kind of where it's coming from. I don't know. Does anybody else have trouble with that, or is that just me? It's just me. I'll take that. I'll take the
have something there to
go for Rick.
This is the end of it in 2 blank days, and this is the part we can see. So
I know.
maybe a placeholder for an endpoint.
It must be defining an endpoint, I guess, but how they get to the endpoint is not an observable phenomenon. I guess that's what I'm saying. So I might try it. I guess we could try it, but I guess if we have our solar eclipse glasses, we could sort of do this. But
we do, and that's what I've told everybody to keep their sun watcher glasses handy. Because actually, I have used them, the solar eclipse glasses, to see that first gleam of the sun where it comes up on the horizon.
That's right. And you get a sort of
get blinded.
You get a totally different there's a different perspective because you can actually see the nature of the upper limb and how it I know.
Yeah, you can just actually watch it rise.
Yeah.
It's real fun.
It's great.
So your eclipse glasses have just as well beyond eclipses for us cultural astronomers.
Anyway, I'm fascinated by the stick, by everything. I hit the detail he goes into about sort of like how it works and how to these particular tables here. I hope you guys all took a really, really close look at them because these are just fascinating. What are you laughing at? I mean, you can't see them on my screen, but you see them in your paper, right? So
yeah, they are absolutely. A lot of his permutations and statistics and graphs were very mind-bending for me.
I know it was
numbers. What?
Here's the sort of his calculations of the various total of months for the first AB lines. This is a year's worth of thing, and if you add all this up, this is what he's saying. You add all this up, you get 355 days, which is essentially 12 lunations. So a lunar year, if you want, is 10 days short of a solar year, and all of this works. The other thing, I think the notion, there's something I'd really like to think through more, is the difference between identifying days that you can't see the moon or days that are not counted. You know what I mean? And he talks about both. He says in this particular case, they just don't count these days. So in this particular stick, there's that implies to me that there are gaps in the sequence of days that aren't registered on the stick. There's times where they just skip. They just don't do it. And that's sort of, I thought that was kind of interesting to me too. I also wanted to ask you guys, in your expertise, and it probably is a 1985 thing, but as he's describing sort of this stick and the importance of this stick and our understanding of astronomical knowledge, he mentions medicine wheels a lot. And so I don't necessarily know medicine wheels maybe as much as other people do. And I'm just sort of, I'm thinking that the fact that that was in archaeoastronomy of the day when he was writing this particular paper, that must have been prevalent. People must have been sort of studying and writing about medicine wheels a lot. Otherwise, he wouldn't have mentioned them so much.
You're
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Does,
No, it
does
was
that track? Is that fit your understanding, Chris? Is that right?
Yeah. It was the West's 80s answer to the 60s Stonehenge, really.
Oh,
right.
okay. So
Specifically the bighorn medicine wheel, and now is
Right.
where we need Ivy.
yeah, she should be here. So so I just sort of inferred that. I don't know the history, but it makes sense to me, Chris, that there was I think there's researchers, authors, paper writers, right? They're going to write about what's happening now, and apparently there must have been some sort of new revelations popping out about medicine wheels that attracted everybody's attention at the time. And then he mentions it sort of as it's almost like this is not that, right? And so this is actually something else. This isn't the same as medicine wheels. This is something.
And let me give you kind of some of my thoughts about things we've discussed so far. Remember, Marshak was a Paleolithic archaeologist.
Sure.
That was his thing. And I think he was right on with the interpreting the lunar series on the bones from Europe. I'm a little more skeptical of his ties to Asia.
Okay.
I believe this is really probably very much a North American phenomenon. He's correct. It has nothing to do with Mesoamerica. But recall the ancient Egyptians also had a month that was composed of 3 10-day weeks.
Mm-hmm.
This was a common thing. But I'm very skeptical of the ideas of diffusionism over such a long period of time, because I'm more of the school that I think this is probably the result of independent invention. And
so I don't disagree with you, and I would sort of it would make some sense, but he's very articulate about it in his I guess I'm not going to just find it right away, but in about the last 4 pages where he really brings forward a link of knowledge,
I could be totally wrong. Last year, Timothy Darville, I don't know if you know him, but he's a Stonehenge expert. He's done a lot of excavation at Stonehenge, and that's really where he made his bones. And he had a paper last year or the year before where he tied the premise of his paper was that Stonehenge was a giant calendar, very much like this. And every time I hear that, my hackles raise a little bit, because it starts to sound like the very beginning of the antiquarians in Europe, where archaeoastronomy came from, and how we got our black eye with archaeologists, you know, with some Hawkins stuff. But the more you look at his paper, the gist of it is he's talking about how the calendar of Stonehenge, and you know, obviously all the pieces aren't there to fully vet out his theory, was that it was the ancient Egyptian civil calendar of the 3 weeks, you know, 3 10-day weeks in a month, and you know, I'm not going to do his research justice by trying to pull it out, you know, shoot from the hip. So you know, Timothy Darville, I'd suggest checking it out if you'd like.
Yeah, maybe a future paper. I'd love to sort of like,
Yeah.
I kind of like to keep going down this trail a little bit because I think it's fascinating.
And even though I'm not a diffusionist, he made some valid points. I mean, you know, recall that ancient Egypt started off as a lunar society, right? Their calendar was a lunar calendar. They had a lunar cult, and at some point, a solar cult.
They sort of converted,
usurped, probably forcibly, the older lunar cult
mm-hmm.
in a power shift, which very well may be represented at Stonehenge as well. I mean, Stonehenge is very old, but it's, you know, it's still younger than the pyramids.
Mm-hmm. Well, those
are interesting ideas all around.
It is, but there's also just sort of just the natural.
We must always apply caution.
Yeah, the natural link between just lunar cycles and ritual cycles, especially in religions. I mean, it's undeniable. I mean, you have to sort of, it's there. So I think the fascination here is the knowledge base it takes to sort of link the two together. At some point, right, everybody has to link back to a solar calendar. And so how do you use a lunar calendar to drive all of your activity, essentially cultural activity, and then, you know, link that to a solar calendar that drives your economics, if you want, you know, when you, what you do, your occupational calendar, the practical one is solar. And so anyway, it's just, I sort of like this for all those reasons. Let me just see, I've got maybe another question for everybody or something I want to do. Oh, I was kind of just, it's, you know, how sometimes you read something, it's like, duh, right? Right, aha. What he was talking about is in his at the very beginning, kind of in the spreadsheet, just the number of cultures that have names for months. You know, and I've known this essentially about North American cultures because I use it in my, you know, in my talks, and I use it in my public things, right? This is the blue moon, and I'm not in blue moon, a wolf moon, a harvest moon, a sturgeon moon, you know, and then a little deeper, you know, most of those names come from Native American tradition, right? All that stuff. But he kind of goes into a little bit more detail about how, you know, many cultures in many different language groups have names for months. And just sort of automatically there's this, you understand there's this cultural value to understanding months and being able to track them. And so anyway, it just was a duh. I just never really thought about it that obvious before.
And if I may add one thing, the Mesoamerican, the Mayan, and the Chinese share 10 of the same names. Like the
do they really?
Rabbit. Yeah.
Okay. Wait a second. Are you saying that like the Chinese, what we call the Chinese zodiac, actually matches a Mesoamerican?
The year of the rabbit, the year of the dragon, all appear in the Mayan.
I think
at least 10 of them are the same.
I think I'm a monkey, if I remember. Okay. Anyway, I thought that was kind of cool. And then the last big note, let me just sort of like read my notes real quick, just make sure I kind of covered everything I wanted to talk about. Yeah, so let me just sort of, I thought this was kind of interesting. And so on page 48, if you want to do this is sort of as he's kind of coming to some conclusions or writing. Yeah, it's actually 2 paragraphs from the top. He quotes Elgard. I don't know Elgard. Do you know Ellegard, Chris?
It doesn't jump to mind.
Anyway, he quotes this author as saying, I'll just read this. It says, he states categorically that accurate astronomical record keeping cannot exist before the development of urban civilization and the invention of writing and higher arithmetic consisting of addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. The Winnebago chief, Sizon Hakau, he's the one we're working with, made an accurate functional non-arithmetic observational lunar intercalary notation through, though he was illiterate and or pre-literate, non-scientific or pre-scientific in Western use of the term. And so I think that's kind of, I think he's making a pretty strong statement here, is that, there's one way to look at this is, and this is what astronomers might do, is say, there's no way you can do this until you have some sort of calculus, you have some sort of basis of knowledge and scientific knowledge.
Yeah, I wouldn't say calculus, but I think what he's referring to is, let's take for example, the 18.5 lunar cycle, right? That gets attributed to cultures all over the place, even though there's zero ethnographic evidence for it.
But be aware of the Newark Mounds there in Ohio, east of Columbus.
I'm good friends with Bill. I'm very well aware of it, but there's no ethnographic. What I said, there's no ethnographic evidence of it. Robert, the first time anybody ever mentioned a lunar cycle was in the early 20th century, before Locklear, but there is no ethnographic evidence. But what I'm saying, to become aware of something that long scale, the argument goes you would have to have some kind of writing system to record it, because it is very much
right
generational observation, right? And you'd have to be able to record it. I would counter, though, that the Inca have a very robust astronomy and never developed writing as we know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I agree. It sort of gets back to that it's almost like the kind of, I don't know, one of the founding premises of archaeoastronomy is trying to find that there was a richer knowledge in the background than we have found, and that this is proof that these people knew more than we think they knew, or whatever. And I think he's basically, he's sort of like panning that a little bit. So that's kind of hogwash. You can observe, you can track, you can embed astronomical knowledge in your culture, and you don't have to use arithmetic to do it. And I believe that's kind of maybe one of the major premises of the paper.
No, and that's one of the things I found interesting about I don't know if you can scroll back to it, the very first section of the paper where they were talking about the North American astronomy. And this kind of applies to what we've seen some is, there was a description there by Cushing of in Zuni about the sunrise and watching the shadows of the solar monoliths line up. And I've seen pictures of some of these solar monoliths down in Zuni recently, and these are the same ones we see out at Yellow Jacket. So
if I could use what you just said, Greg, as a launching spot to hijack the remaining 7 minutes Rick has. You mentioned in this paper that he really talks about this stick as a one-off, right?
Actually, later in the paper, he starts to sort of bring forward, there's more, right? There's and they were found sort of in Mississippi culture, and sort of like, and I have a little understanding of mound culture and Cahokia and some of that kind of stuff. And the intertrade sequence of the whole eastern United States was totally robust. I mean, you can expect anything in the Gulf Coast to end up in Minnesota, and anything in Minnesota to end up in New York. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of movement around and intercultural contact. So anyway, so
a year later, Marshak published another paper that ended up in the Oxford II conference, that ended up in Avini's World Archaeoastronomy. It's called North American Indian Calendar Sticks, Evidence of a Widely Distributed Tradition.
There you go. I think
This
he
was
he was
1 year
probably getting
later.
there at the end of this paper and then decided to write about that.
I tried to get it for you, and I looked and I looked and I looked, and all I could find is my paper copy. Couldn't find my digital. I wanted,
Okay.
but I figured this was a pretty big bite anyway.
Yeah, no, this is good.
But let me just read a couple bits from this other paper.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Greg already mentioned Cushing's 1941 ethnography, where he reported that a sun priest named Nayuchi, and this is a quote, Nayuchi responds as he cuts the last notch of his pine wood calendar, and both hasten back to call from the house stops the glad tidings of the return of spring. So he was using his calendar stick to mark the return of spring. Now, John G. Burke in 1884 was introduced to Nayuchi by Cushing, and Burke actually drew a picture of this calendar stick in the I believe it was 1897. Burke describes the stick carried by Nayuchi apparently as a symbol of the sign of his status, and he wrote that the Zuni month was divided into 3 parts of 10 days each, with dots and signs added to mark ritual and festival days. So there we have actually ethnographic data that the dots above the notches were put there in the Zuni tradition to mark the ceremonial days. So we have a Zuni reference. Then he goes on to say an Algonquin-speaking Wajibi named Fred Pine recalled his grandfather had been called he who walks with a calendar stick, implying that the calendar sticks could also be used as walking sticks and status symbols. It says a fascinating 19th century ethnographic account comes from the diary of an Algonquin-speaking Ojibwa woman. She says, my father kept count of the days on a stick. He had a stick long enough to last a year, and he always began a new stick in the fall. He cut a big notch for the first day of a new moon and a small notch for each of the other days. I will begin my story at the time he began a new counting stick.
That's really cool.
And then he goes on to say, besides the one from Sijun Haku that we've been talking about tonight, he said 2 other Winnebago calendar sticks from the second half of the 19th century were located, each visually different from the other, and from the calendar stick it's even. And then he goes on for the rest of the article at a very similar discussion on one of these other 2 calendar sticks from the Winnebago people, from the first one that he talked about a year earlier. So we at least have 3 physical Winnebago calendar sticks that we could study. We have the ethnographic Zuni account from the 19th century, and then we have Ojibwe and Algonquin ethnographic accounts as well. So there's.
I'm glad you brought all that up, because I was actually going to ask you after I read this. I said so this, because this was 1985, surely some other people sort of picked up on this.
I don't know if the answer to that is yes. I mean, this was 86, right? And then
we forgot about sticks after that.
Right. And then I mentioned before Pocketat's book.
Yeah.
Which Pocketat, he really does a good job. You mentioned Marshak saying, what can we really learn from the archaeology about the way they thought? Right. And that's why this book is
that thought doesn't readily translate into archaeology.
Right. Well, exactly what this book, Archaeology of the Cosmos, is about.
Oh, okay.
It's about how we can, you know, how we can unbundle and unentangle all this stuff from the evidence that's left behind. Now, I'm obviously, you know, a little more on the conservative side, so I think Pocketot maybe takes it one step too far in a couple places. John, of course, he goes full on in with the lunar alignments.
Can you spell that? Can you spell that name? I was going to look at it.
Timothy R. Pocketot, Pauketat. I've heard people correct me and say Pocketal, but I've heard him call himself Pocketat, so I'm going to go with what he calls himself.
Good idea.
He's got a lot of really interesting stuff, and the Archaeology of the Cosmos is a really good springboard into it. Really, there were two books I discovered at the same time, which kind of blew my mind. This was one of them.
Oh, good.
And the other one was Brian Hayden's book here, which I've probably went on about before, but The Power of Ritual and Prehistory, Secret Societies in the Order of Social Complexity.
Sounds almost like a Joseph Campbell kind of.
Yeah, I mean, Hayden's an archaeologist from the Northwest, I believe. And he does exhaustive research on Native American cultures and secret societies. And we've seen a lot of that stuff in our own journal club as we've gone through here with some of the work. You know, that some of the conclusions that Andy and Kim came up with in some of the Chacoan houses about how alignments changed when the secret societies that governed alignments
That's interesting.
took over power. But this really takes it, you know, and some of their stuff was based on Ward's work, and this builds on Ward. But Hayden's underlying current is these secret societies were predatory upon society, right? They were for the benefit of themselves, the acquisition of power, and enticing people with secret esoteric knowledge. And if you really take that on the one hand, and some of the stuff that Pocketot talks about, the other bundling stuff, because they both kind of hit me at the same time, and it really made me think differently about this field of cultural astronomy and what could have been going on here. But that's my soapbox.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I'm kind of ready to close on the paper. And Chris, I really appreciate you suggesting this one. I of course wouldn't have picked this one myself. I didn't even know it existed.
Yeah, it's been in my back pocket for a while.
I know, and I just really enjoyed reading it. I got into it like when we first started it, and I thought, oh, I'm going to have to spend some time with this. And then I did find it really good.
Indeed.
And I was just kind of trying to, it's just that idea, how much can you write about a stick? And but there's a tremendous amount of things.
It certainly kind of makes you almost want to make your own, doesn't it?
It does.
Does that include instructions, the article? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
or sell calendar sticks on our website store.
So 7, I have to believe that you maybe thought this was a 6 o'clock show instead of a 5 o'clock show.
Who, me?
But you're not. You're muted.
6 o'clock Mountain Daylight Time.
You can always tell when somebody shows up just as we're wrapping, and so they're like, okay, I got it. So,
It won't be a problem next month.
but it's good to see you.
Let me throw one thing out there, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Talking about Tim and the Cosmos book and so forth. Down at Cahokia,
Mm-hmm.
they have the wood hen.
Yes.
which is approximately the size of a football field in diameter. And they've got telephone poles placed. There are several different iterations of it they found around it. What sort of accuracy could they have developed using that to monitor alignments of the celestial planets, stars, seasons? I mean, with a diameter of a football field, you could really get precision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I visited. There's a rebuild. Have you been there?
Yeah.
They're
Mhm.
sort of-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
they rebuilt them.
And then they all gather there on solstices and equinoxes.
Oh, do they? Yes.
Yeah, early morning.
See, they tend to explain it as a ceremonial site,
Unmute.
but I can't see, it might have been used
Mute.
as that from time to time, but I think its primary purpose was to make observations.
I disagree with you, and I'll tell you why.
Yeah,
I don't think there is a such thing as an ancient observatory. I think, and here's why the field of cultural astronomy has really stopped using that term, is because an observatory like Ric has is someplace where you go to learn about the cosmos, right? You go to view and it's about the acquisition of knowledge is what they call an observatory. And most of what we find in indigenous astronomies, with Maya E groups and, Stonehenge and wood circles, if, the jury's still out on wood circles, but wood circles is that what ancient people were doing is they already knew about their cosmos. They weren't trying to learn about it. They were taking what they knew about their cosmos and they were incorporating it into their architecture, right? So if they have a building that's aligned to the sunrise on a certain day, they're not looking to learn anything else about that point on the horizon when the sun's rising. That already means something to them. That already has a rich history to them. And as Avini always says, they could get that with 2 sticks. But the reason they build it into stone and the reason they go to the effort is because it's meaningful as a representation of their cosmos, very much like like a kiva is a representation of the Southwest cosmos. And they're building it ceremonially in in veneration of that, not to learn anything else. Does that make sense?
it makes perfect sense. Or though you still could watch the planets move and do some other things with it.
Sure. Yep. And it is aligned pretty well from viewing east. You can see the sunrise above Monk's Mound.
Right. Yeah, exactly. On that southern edge.
Yeah, what Ruggles would call the temporal equinox, or the midpoint between solstices. Avoid the
Very
term
good.
equinox.
Hey, everybody, I appreciate everybody coming today. It looks like we have another
A friend of mine, yeah, we're about to wrap it up here. So
but I'm going to actually say goodbye. I'm going to kind of just head out of here.
Let me just add one last thing. Next month, we're going to have Brian Bates talk about astronomy and rock art. Once he's back from the Grand Canyon. And then in December, I'm going to come back and do a deep dive into Inuit astronomy and astronomy of the Arctic, and some of the star myths that are involved in that. So I hope everybody comes back for that.
That's excellent.
For sure.
yes,
Bye.
we will.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Take it easy. See y'all next time.